Hello, everyone. Today it is great to see you on our journey through the Bible. I'm glad you could join us today. I'm Tim, retired pastor and Bible teacher, and your guide through the Bible during this year. Our reading for today was in Lamentations, chapter 1, chapter 2. You probably got the idea from these two chapters that this is uh, not a happy book. Jeremiah wrote this in response to what he saw as Jerusalem was overrun and the Babylonians took over and the temple was torn down. People were starving. Um, Unlike a lot of other prophets, he not only had the task of delivering the warning of God's judgment, but he actually had to watch it happen there in Jerusalem. And this is the result. Proverbs 13:15 says, "The way of transgressors is hard." People were learning that as they saw God's hand. Now, some will tell you, hey, wait a minute, the way of transgressors is fun, fun, fun. At least until the wages of sin come due. That was the case with people in Jerusalem. When all the warnings given by Jeremiah arrived at their door, and no, the prophet was not glad that he was right and everyone else was wrong. He was grieving over Jerusalem, and he wrote this book that's in our Bible just to express his grief. Well, so we started out with the way we look at ourselves. There was a boy who told his mother once he was 8 feet tall. Of course, his ruler was only 6 inches long. He counted each of those as 1 foot. See, a lot of people look at themselves as pretty good because their ruler is a bit short. When we measure ourselves spiritually, we need to look at a true and accurate standard. You remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20? He said, "Except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven." People are probably thinking, who could be more righteous than scribes and Pharisees? Their lives were devoted to that, and yes, if that was not enough as far as God is concerned. And he wanted people to understand no one is good enough for heaven. Apart from the grace of God, we simply come to him and accept what Jesus did for us on the cross and accept his righteousness. So let's think about God's righteousness for a minute. Speaking for Jerusalem, he says in Lamentations 1:18, "The Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against his commandment. Hear, I pray you, all people, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men are gone into captivity." Finally, people were learning that God is the standard for righteousness. And as he writes, Jeremiah points out 4 consequences of rebellion against God's righteousness. One is sorrow and tears. They were going through that. Verse 12, "Is there any sorrow like my sorrow?" There was stern correction, verses 13 to 15. Jeremiah uses some illustrations to describe this kind of correction that we're talking about here. Part of it comes from our own conscience. Everyone has a conscience. In Lamentations 1:13 it says, "From above he hath sent fire into my bones." That's the way your conscience has an effect on you. It affects you physically. He used the analogy of a net. God's word can be a net of safety for those who follow it, and it can become a trap for those who abandon it. And now Jerusalem was caught in that net, and the city needed God's instruction on how to get out. But there's no escape unless there's escape that comes from God. The true purpose of this net was to turn God's people back from just total self-destruction. Third, he used the illustration of a yoke. The yoke of God is easy. Jesus said that. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. But the yoke of sin is a heavy burden. You see, you have to choose. You're going to be yoked to something or someone. If you're yoked to God, that's much easier than being yoked to sin. God would use this yoke that they had, and they were yoked to sin, to correct and chastise his people so they could turn back to him. And then fourthly, he uses the illustration of a wine press. And often in the Bible, it's used as a symbol or an illustration of God's judgment as he presses out the grapes with his pressure In Isaiah chapter 63, it talks about that. Revelation chapter 14, it uses that picture. But God's punitive judgment always has restoration in mind. Peter said in 2 Peter 3:9, that's the case with this earth and the heavens and the earth that are all going to be destroyed. And the reason why is because God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth. His affliction on his people is used for correction of the offender and for future generations. But I think Lamentations is given to us in part because you have a choice. The people in Jerusalem had made their choice, and it's good to see what your choices lead to. The way the transgressor is hard. Is that what you're looking for? Or on the other hand, Psalm 16:11 says, "In thy presence is fullness of joy, and at thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore." You get to choose. So what's it going to be? The hardness that they were going through that you read about in Lamentations, or the joy that you find in your Lord? Think about that today, will you, my friends? And keep reading. We only have one more day in Lamentations, and that's our reading for tomorrow. Lamentations chapter 3 to chapter 5. Be reading there, and I'll look forward to being back with you again very soon.